The airport was buzzing with the usual chaos, boarding announcements echoing overhead, the rolling thunder of suitcases dragged across polished floors, and the impatient shuffle of travelers eager to get settled. Marcus Bennett, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, walked calmly through the jet bridge, his polished leather shoes clicking softly against the floor. His presence was understated but commanding, the kind of aura that made people glance twice without fully knowing why. Clad in a perfectly tailored navy suit and carrying nothing but a sleek leather briefcase, Marcus didn't need to flash wealth or status, it emanated quietly from the way he carried himself. He approached his first-class seat, 3A, only to find a young white woman already reclined in it, scrolling casually through her phone as though she owned the row. Marcus paused, adjusted his cufflinks, and offered a polite but firm smile. "Excuse me," he said evenly, "I believe you're in my seat." The woman glanced up, gave him a once-over that lingered just long enough to be insulting, and scoffed. "No, I don't think so," she replied, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is my seat. You must be confused. Coach is back there." She gestured lazily toward the rear of the aircraft, dismissing him as though he were an inconvenience instead of a fellow passenger. A ripple of discomfort passed through the nearby passengers, some pretending not to notice, others casting quick, curious glances at the standoff. Marcus remained composed, his deep brown eyes steady as he held out his boarding pass. "Seat 3A, as you can see," he said gently, but the woman didn't even bother looking at the ticket. Instead, she crossed her arms defiantly and muttered, "People like you don't usually sit here." The words landed like a slap, hushed but sharp enough that those closest heard them. A flight attendant, sensing tension, hurried over, her smile polite but strained. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Marcus handed her the boarding pass without hesitation, maintaining his dignity in the face of the woman's blatant rudeness. The attendant's face flushed when she checked the ticket, her professional composure cracking for a moment as she realized who was in the wrong. "Ma'am," she said firmly, turning to the woman, "this is his assigned seat. I'll need to see your boarding pass, please." The woman shifted uncomfortably, refusing to make eye contact, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrest as if letting go would mean surrender. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, though her voice carried enough for everyone around to hear. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not raise his voice or lash out. He had dealt with prejudice his entire life and knew that dignity was often the sharpest weapon against ignorance. The attendant repeated her request, more firmly this time, while the whispers among passengers swelled, curiosity and tension spreading like wildfire. Marcus exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar weight of assumptions pressing against him, but he also knew something the woman didn't, something that would soon turn this uncomfortable moment into a lesson she would never forget. The murmurs around the cabin grew louder as passengers leaned toward one another, whispering in disbelief at the audacity of the woman who refused to move, while Marcus stood patiently, his tall frame relaxed but his eyes steady, unwilling to be rattled by her arrogance. The flight attendant, now visibly embarrassed, tried again, her tone more urgent. "Ma'am, you'll need to vacate this seat, his ticket clearly shows this is his." But the woman only dug her heels deeper, her voice rising enough to draw attention from rows ahead. "I paid for this seat, and I'm not moving just because some man thinks he deserves it. This is mine, and I'm staying put." The way she said, "some man," carried the same sharpness as her earlier jab, cloaking her prejudice in a veneer of entitlement. Marcus glanced briefly at the onlookers, some shook their heads in disbelief while others stared with that uneasy curiosity reserved for moments when social tension exploded in public spaces. He adjusted his tie, inhaled slowly, and pulled out his phone, typing quickly with one hand while still standing firm. The flight attendant, recognizing his restraint, seemed torn between enforcing authority and escalating the matter to security. Before she could act, however, the cabin intercom crackled, and the captain's voice requested the lead attendant to step to the cockpit. Within minutes, the captain himself appeared, tall and confident in his crisp uniform, his eyes immediately scanning the situation before locking onto Marcus with recognition that softened his stern features. "Mr. Bennett," he said warmly, offering a respectful nod, is there a problem here? The entire first-class cabin fell into stunned silence. Whispers rippled instantly. Who was this man the captain addressed by name? Why did he speak with such reverence? The woman's defiance faltered as she looked between them, confusion creeping into her expression. Yes, Marcus replied calmly, gesturing toward her without raising his voice, this passenger insists I don't belong in my assigned seat. His words were simple, but the weight behind them was undeniable, exposing her assumptions without him ever needing to accuse her outright. The captain's jaw tightened as he turned to the woman. Ma'am, let me be very clear, this seat belongs to Mr. Bennett, and you will need to move immediately. If you continue to refuse, I will have no choice but to escort you off this plane. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin, and the woman's cheeks flushed crimson as the reality of her position sank in. She sputtered, but I didn't know who he was, her voice trembling as though that somehow excused her behavior. Marcus remained silent, his expression unreadable, allowing the weight of her words to echo in the cabin. The captain, however, did not flinch. It should never matter who he is, he said firmly, his voice carrying down the aisles. Every passenger is entitled to respect. The woman sank further into the seat, torn between humiliation and stubbornness, but the inevitable was approaching. What she thought was a simple act of claiming entitlement had spiraled into a confrontation that would soon shatter her assumptions and expose the truth about the man she had tried so hard to dismiss. The cabin felt as if it had stopped breathing, every passenger frozen in anticipation of what would happen next, the hum of the engines now the only sound breaking the tension. The woman's bravado cracked as she clutched her handbag tighter, her eyes darting nervously between the captain, the attendant, and Marcus, who stood with an unshakable calm that only magnified her unease. The captain crouched slightly to her level, his voice sharp but professional. Ma'am, you are occupying a seat that does not belong to you. This is not negotiable, and your refusal is disrupting the flight. She opened her mouth to protest again but faltered when Marcus finally spoke, his tone even yet laced with a quiet power that demanded attention. I didn't want this to escalate, he said, his deep voice carrying across the cabin, but I will not be disrespected in silence. The woman's lips trembled as she fumbled for excuses, muttering, I didn't know. I didn't mean, but the words trailed off when the captain straightened and looked at her squarely. Perhaps you don't understand who you're speaking to. This is Mr. Marcus Bennett, the CEO and majority owner of this airline. A stunned hush fell instantly, followed by audible gasps and murmurs that rippled like waves through the cabin. The woman's face drained of color, her jaw slack as the revelation hit her with the force of a blow, her dismissive arrogance, her smug insistence that people like you don't usually sit here, now stood exposed in the most humiliating light possible. Nearby passengers shifted in their seats, some whispering incredulously, others shaking their heads at her audacity, while a few cast admiring glances toward Marcus, who hadn't once raised his voice or lost his composure. The woman stammered weakly, I didn't know, I thought, but Marcus held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. His voice was steady, calm, but there was no mistaking the edge of disappointment in it. That's exactly the point. You didn't know, but you assumed. You assumed I didn't belong here, that I couldn't possibly be the one with the right to this seat. You judged me before you even looked at the truth. His words cut through the cabin sharper than any raised tone ever could, and the silence that followed was suffocating, every passenger reflecting on the uncomfortable truth he had laid bare. The captain nodded solemnly, adding, respect should never depend on status. Whether he owns the airline or not, every traveler is entitled to dignity. The woman's eyes glistened with shame, her earlier defiance shattered into fragments of regret. She opened her mouth again, but nothing came out, no excuse, no denial, only a silence heavy with humiliation. Slowly, she began to rise from the seat she had so stubbornly clung to, the weight of dozens of eyes on her as she moved, each step back toward Coach burning with a lesson she would never forget. Marcus then lowered himself into his rightful seat with quiet dignity, not triumph, and his calm composure only magnified the respect now blooming among the passengers who had witnessed a prejudice exposed and a truth revealed. The flight resumed its rhythm after the tense confrontation, but the atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted dramatically, the earlier hum of chatter replaced by a thoughtful quiet as passengers replayed the scene in their minds, some glancing at Marcus with newfound respect while others stared into their laps, humbled by the uncomfortable truth they had just witnessed. Marcus leaned back in his rightful seat, not with arrogance or satisfaction, but with the composed air of a man long accustomed to such moments, his dignity intact and his focus already drifting toward the work waiting for him at his destination. Yet the woman in coach could not escape the weight of what had unfolded. She sat rigid, her face pale, shame gnawing at her, the whispers of other passengers feeling louder than the engines roaring outside. Eventually, unable to bear the tension, Marcus rose from his seat midway through the flight and walked toward the back, his presence drawing startled looks as he passed down the narrow aisle. When he stopped beside the woman, she froze, her fingers tightening around her armrest as though bracing for public humiliation, but instead Marcus's voice was calm, low, and unexpectedly kind. "We all make mistakes," he said, his gaze steady but not cruel, "but what matters is whether we learn from them. You judged me without knowing me, and it cost you your dignity today. Don't let it cost you more tomorrow." Her eyes welled with tears, her pride crumbling under the weight of his grace, and she whispered, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said what I did." Marcus nodded slightly, accepting her apology without fanfare. "Just remember," he continued softly, "every seat, first class or coach, belongs to a human being who deserves respect." With that, he turned and walked back to his place, leaving her with more than humiliation. He left her with a chance at redemption, a chance to see the world differently. When the plane landed hours later, passengers filed out with a different kind of energy than when they had boarded. Some paused to shake Marcus's hand, others offered quiet words of admiration, while a few simply smiled with gratitude for the lesson they had been witness to. The story had already begun to spread among them like wildfire, about the man wrongly dismissed, who turned out to be the owner of the very airline carrying them, and who handled bigotry not with fury, but with unshakable dignity. For the woman, the experience carved itself into her memory like a scar, but also like a compass pointing her toward humility. She walked off the plane quieter, softer, burdened with regret but also gifted with a truth she would never again ignore. And for Marcus, it was simply another reminder of why he led the way he did, with patience, with grace, and with the unwavering belief that respect was the highest class any of them could ever fly in.